I just want to kind of make a disclaimer here as we start this series today. When I put together a learning session, I like to do it as a compilation. I compile facts that I read with from the great authors that we have in our field. I kind of go to my own experience, but the most important thing that I rely on is the fact that I have interacted with artistic and very smart histotechnologists like yourself who have shared things with me, and so I kind of pick up a general popular consensus as to what the population of histotechnologists think about certain subjects. I've been very fortunate to travel all over and spend a lot of times in all kinds of labs, and I will tell you that I have learned more from folks like you than I have from any book. With that said, I also want to let you know I do not consider myself an expert. I am simply relaying some information that I got from these several different ways. I'm going to make a statement first, though. For specimen orientation and microtomy to even become relevant, then there are some processes that must be completed successfully, or we don't even get to that middle stage of the cycle of histology. So first of all, we've got to get a proper collection of a specimen. We rely on our surgeons and our family practitioners to get those specimens for us, that they're put into fixative really quick and they're fixed properly, not dry, not necrotic. So we need a good specimen brought to us first. Then we need someone who has knowledge of anatomy, gross anatomy, so that they can select relevant slices of the tissue, something we call grossing. Then one of the more important parts is that we need to come up with a schedule based on type and size of the specimen to properly process this tissue. And of course we do this by automatic tissue processing. So if we have actually finished our processing, our collection, and our selection, then we'll move on to the agenda. We'll assume that we have finished this, and we're going to look at embedding, selection of paraffins, some basic principles, and again, these basic principles were compiled from books, things that I heard, and things that I saw in labs. Then we'll go to microtomy, look at the instruments, blades, some general tips, some ergonomics, and then we'll just ask the question, manual or automated. So without further ado, let's define embedding. Now there are many ways to define embedding. You can embed a rock in a wall, you can embed a footprint in concrete, but in histology, embedding is defined as the enclosing of a tissue sample in molten paraffin. And then we apply light pressure to the specimen during chilling so that we can adhere the tissue, you've all done this, to the bottom of this. And we all know that when we've got like, what, 5 or 6 or 8 pieces of tissue, that's a real trick and a real art to get all those embedded down flat and level so that when we approach this with the microtome, we'll have all the tissue in the same plane. That really is an artist's work. So the specimen at this point should be correctly orientated and flat against the bottom of the molds. When you are selecting the size of a embedding mold, you want to select one that allows plenty of paraffin to surround the tissue so that you have a great support system there. Don't try to squeeze a huge piece of tissue into this small space and not have it have a lot of paraffin around. You'll have a hard time cutting it. So when we look at paraffins, there's basically only a couple of types. I don't mean what they're made of, but just there's a low melting point paraffin, there's a high melting point paraffin. It's all relative to the degree at which the paraffin will melt. Typically when you set your processors, you're going to bump that temperature up just a degree or two so that it will maintain this melted state. You don't need to run it up to 65 or 70 because you can actually do harm to your specimens making it too hot. The low melting point paraffin is usually softer. Coarse ribboning, coarse sectioning might be more difficult. Ribboning is typically easier. With the high melting point, it's harder, and therefore you get better support for hard tissue. Thinner sections are possible, but ribboning might be more difficult. But then again, there are other factors that play into this. It doesn't mean you can't get a beautiful ribbon. It just may be slightly harder to get. Now, when we talk about paraffin, most of the paraffins used in histology are mixtures created to arrive at a certain hardness or melting point. And it's very possible, and probably many of you do this, you use one type of paraffin for infiltration and another for embedding. It's not a real good idea to use a hard infiltrator and a soft embedding paraffin. The wonderful thing about this, though, is that the vendors who actually produce and provide two types, one for embedding, one for infiltrating, will give you the right types to do what with, so you can't mess it up and it'll work well for you. There are many paraffin additives. Right in our current situation, most of them are plastic polymers. Back in the old days when I was in histo school, we used candle wax, and we would put beeswax in it to reduce the crystal size. It would increase the stickiness and adhesion. Rubber was also used. It says it reduces brittleness. It just, in my mind, that's kind of like, I would think it would cause brittleness, but apparently not. But it increases stickiness, which enhances ribboning, just like the beeswax did. If we tried to ribbon a block of paraffin with no beeswax in it, with just that candle paraffin, it was virtually impossible. Sometimes they'll mix waxes together to get that smaller crystal, and the reason we want smaller crystals is for better infiltration of the paraffin into, obviously, the tissue. Plastic polymers, like I said, are really what most paraffins is the additive for most paraffins, because it increases hardness, it improves support, you can get thinner sections, and so these plastic polymer versions of paraffin would be the ones that would be more likely to be the high temperature, melting temperature. Now, as we move on to some principles, we've selected our paraffin, we've got great tissue. We want to think about a couple of things. The specimen should be orientated so that the cut surface shows the desired plane of view. Now, this is pretty basic and simple. You don't want to embed a vas deferens on its side so that you cut up through the tunnel and you don't know if the luminous is full and if they got a complete cross section. So there are reasons why, certain things should be embedded certain ways. So that's the first thing. We want to make sure it's embedded so we can see what we need to see. Then specimens should be orientated so that the plane of least resistance is presented to the blade. Between the paraffin block and the blade, there's a lot of friction. And anything that we can do to eliminate or reduce that friction is going to help us get a better cut. So we'll look at that a little more closely as we go. So some of the common structures that we have to deal with in specimen orientation, again, the tubular structures, the vas, the veins, fallopian tubes, etc. Different types of skin biopsies. We've got needle biopsies. Then there's the miscellaneous specimens from the gastrointestinal tract, gallbladder, cyst, and we've got hard specimens. Bones are definitely hard, even if they're decaled. And we all know that cervix, especially if it's slightly overprocessed, can feel just like a bone. And I don't know about you, but I have chunked out more than 1 or 2 pieces of cervix in my day. So that's considered pretty hard too. So if we start with the tubular structures, we're just simply going to take a cross section, we're going to lay it down flat, and we're going to be able to see right through the little tunnel. And again, that's extremely important to see that with a vas deferens or a fallopian tube, because somebody's rest of their life is depending on that to be done right. So that's fairly simple. Just cut it, lay it down, see everything. Now, if we are trying to explain how to orientate that specimen so that we present the plane of least resistance, well, this block kind of does it already, as much as you can do, because if you follow the arrow, then you will see that at the bottom, that's the edge of the block. And as we cut up through the block, we're starting out small, we're getting a little bit larger, and we're only spending a little time going through this entire width of the specimen. So basically, irregardless of how we turn this block around, we're pretty much going to naturally go through this circular specimen, presenting the plane of least resistance and possibly getting the best section we can. Now, the problem comes when we have like multiple sections, which you very rarely just put one section of a tube or one section of a vas or one section of an appendix. So we more than often have multiple sections, and if we embed our tissue just side by side like the face of a dice, then we're going to present double the amount of resistance to our blade when we embed it like this. So what if we embed it like this? That way, we've separated it, but the problem is we have a bigger block probably, and as we go through this, we're going to increase the resistance by 4 times instead of 2 times here. So how about if we try embedding it diagonally? This way we can, every time the blade goes through one, it is barely getting a second, or it's kind of like a 1.5 times. So this orientation actually provides the cutter with the plane of least resistance, because the paraffin itself, shouldn't cause that much resistance. It's when the tissue comes into play that we get that. So that might be a recommendation of how you'd want to embed multiple sections. Now if we go to skin, of course skin is a beast on its own right. We've got multiple types of biopsies, and we've got multiple layers that we're going to want to possibly see in this section. The epidermis, the dermis, and then sometimes subcutaneous tissue. And it's all very important to see that plane so you know what's going on underneath. You know if there's movement of bad cells up or movement of bad cells down or whatever. So it's important that we don't say take this shave biopsy and embed it straight down and just get that entire surface of epidermis. That's not really going to tell us where something might be going or what might actually be happening. So, I know one of the worst things in the world is to embed something like this wrong and cut it away. So you just have to deal with it sometimes. But a shave biopsy, of course, we know is just that. It's a shave. You shave it right off. You hardly get much of anything under the bottom of it. Then we take it over here, and this was kind of a drunk grocer right here because he didn't get his lines very straight, but we're going to bread loaf this shave biopsy. First thing we're going to do is probably dip it in some kind of ink, black ink. Then we're going to bread loaf it into maybe 5 sections. That's pretty normal. Then we're going to turn them up on edge so that the cut side is down. And we're going to carefully embed these so that they're all on the same plane so that we can get into all of them without cutting any of them away. And as far as a punch biopsy goes, we're taking a cylindrical hollow tube and we're pushing it down into the specimen. We're drawing out a cylinder. We're going to cover it with ink, and then we're going to cut it straight down the middle, this side being flipped up with the cut side of both down. So you say, well, what about embedding these? How do we present the plane of least resistance? You're going to see that kind of the same formula goes throughout, but I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but on occasion when I've cut up through a shave biopsy like this, and they certainly can be much smaller than what's represented here, I've peeled up an edge and popped a piece out. That has happened to me more than once. So what we might want to recommend doing is try something else. But first, before I show you that, I want to show you this little guy right here. This is a section of like an ellipse of skin where you bread loaf it just like you did with the shave biopsy and the punch biopsy, or the shave biopsy anyway. And then it has something extra in it. Not only does it have all the layers, the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous tissue, but it has a layer of hair follicles. And as we know, hair follicles like to scratch our blades. So let's say if we use this as our embedding technique, then it's highly possible that we might come up through the bottom layer, nick our blade, and as it goes to the top layer, we might damage the tissue. We might actually, striate it some with the nicks on our blade. So we could say, well, we can stop that by just putting them side by side. And that is one way to do it, and you're perfectly okay if you want to cut it that way. But as far as this rule goes, we are still going to be presenting to the knife edge more resistance than we would if we simply did something like this. And if you had to, you could actually put the ends here and still avoid the resistance as well as the knife marks. I will tell you that this is one little tidbit, and I hope you managed to get at least one nugget out of these things we're going to talk about, but this is one tidbit that I learned from Billy Swisher, who's an excellent histology teacher, a wonderful person, has stuck with me for 35 years when I first took her embedding class. And I do this. I do not allow hair to be over hair because you're not giving your pathologist the best section that you possibly could. So if we do something like this with our shave biopsies, then, we're not going to be hitting this entire 5 sections at one time with the possibility of peeling a piece up. We're going to softly go into these, and the resistance is going to be less. Pretty much the same with the punch biopsy. Not quite as important, though. And I can just hear you people thinking out there saying, ooh, how are we going to put that on a slide, because our pathologists like for their tissue sections to be in a row, an easy row they can follow. Well, just turn it diagonally, put it on your slide like this. You don't need all that paraffin anyway, and just wipe it off. So as we go on to needle biopsies, not terrific amount of things to be said about these, but the same thing. The same thing has happened to me with a needle biopsy that has been embedded something like this. I have peeled up one of these edges and lost part or all of one of the biopsy. And that was probably because I was committing an error in microtomy, but yet it still happened. So if it had been embedded like this, it's going to cut through it at a diagonal and probably less likely to pull one of those biopsies out of its little casing there. Gastrointestinal tract, gallbladder, cyst, some of these large pieces have a wall, and they need to be embedded on edge so that all layers can be seen. You would cut a cross section and then flip it over. Cut the cross section right here, cut the cross section right here, and then turn it over. So we'll get back into the gastrointestinal, and again we're going to cut a cross section, flip it over, and we're going to be able to see everything. The reason that's the case is because, as you know, there are many layers of things that can be in something like gastrointestinal tissue, and the gallbladder is a fairly simple one to do, but cysts seem to be a real problem, because typically cysts are just filled with something that you're going to remove, and then flipping them up on edge is almost like trying to put a piece of saran wrap on edge. So you got to really be patient with those, but they actually do have a wall and need to be flipped on edge so that we can see whatever it is there. To try to orientate them to follow the rule of least resistance, if this is our block and we embedded our tissue like this, then as you can see, we are actually presenting the widest point of the block to the blade, and by doing that we're giving it the most friction we possibly can. If we were to simply turn it a little bit diagonally, we can still place it on the slide straight if we want to, but this will allow us to cut through small to bigger to smaller and spend very little time with least resistance. And you might think, well, you know, what does this mean to my microtome? When your microtome is cutting, it feels those things, and oftentimes you get chatter, you get Venetian blinding because of the fact that it just can't handle the tension between the block and the blade. And of course there are other reasons too, which we'll touch on those a little bit. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, I would just simply flip it up vertically, cut it from this end, get only half of the width. But for right now, I'm just going to put a big X on that, and we're going to come back to that in a slide a little bit later. So, as far as other hard specimens like bones, this is really where the diagonal orientation started. You know, bones are hard. You don't want to come across the full face of this bone because you have more of a chance of pulling it out, biting into it, bite into a little bit, and go up. With a piece of bone like this, you never really get into full resistance. So you'll typically end up with a much better section, cut much easier. So now we have assumed that we've processed, we've embedded properly, and we're going to go look at the microtome instruments. Quite simply, a rotary microtome, a manual rotary microtome, as we all know, has two wheels. One that, of course, advances it toward the blade or away from the blade. If you happen to have an older model instrument, sometimes the blade goes forward and the specimen head stays where it is, and so you would be moving the blade holder back and forth. And then we have on the right side, we have a fine advanced hand wheel that we use when we're either ready to rough cut the block or ribbon. Semi-automated typically has the coarse advance automated, so you just push a button either here or on the bench, and the manual fine feed is still done with your body. So when I go into a field, like I said, I love to get opinions, and the general consensus across the board of generation or location was that if I'm going to automate, I really like a semi-automated instrument because then I can still feel some control in my manual fine feed. And that's all well and good, but there are reasons why, you know, you may want to consider going to fully automated, and we're going to touch on that in a little bit. I'm kind of stringing you along so you don't fall asleep or leave us. Okay, so if we have a fully automatic microtome, then both advances are automated, and there are some really nice models out there. Going back just a second, one of the nicest features of a fully automated microtome is the fact that it will automatically home for you. So in other words, you don't have to worry about rolling, you know, any kind of your coarse feed wheel back. You just push a button and whiz, it goes right back to your home position, and you're ready to start with a new block. Plus all of the little XYZ controls they have, so you can, the recuts are made so much simpler. But anyway, we'll move on. Blades. So back in the day when I was in histotechnology school, I had to use this C-profile blade. All of you out there who had to do it too, just kind of shake your head up and down, and I'll feel the vibrations down here in Florida. So every day we had to hone and strop these things. We used a Belgian waterstone to hone them, and then we had a strap that you would find in a barber's office. So constantly the bevel of the blade was changing. The D-profile tungsten carbide is for like undecalcified bone, something really, really hard, not something you would use to cut paraffin. If you look, a normal wedge angle of a C-profile is 27 degrees. A D-profile is 45, and it's like you're hitting it with, I don't know, I somehow think of a sheer cliff when I look at this, and you're touching the block right here, and your tissue's falling off here. Very sharp, very expensive, and you have to have them specially sharpened, but they are great if you're in a veterinary situation where you're cutting undecalcified animal bones. I mean, they're super. And they also cut plastic. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this, just in case you don't already know, I would like to explain to you very quickly that clearance angle device that you have on your knife holder. You know how you can loosen it up and move it up or move it down. You have it in your cryostat too, and it goes between like 0 degrees and 10 degrees. Well, the reason that that exists on a microtome today is because when we use these steel profile blades and we sharpen them, the bevels changed, the angles changed, and so we had to adjust our angles on our knife holders to make the perfect cut. A clearance angle simply states, if we look at the angle between the lower facet and where the knife actually hits the block, this angle right here is the clearance angle. So if I put my angle lower, then this becomes smaller and I face the block more like this. So if I face the block too much like that, I literally can just rub up and down it and make no sectioning. Now if I move my angle out, this becomes larger, hence you go from 2 to 4 to 6, whatever. But if I make it too acute in this area against the block, then I could just dig into the block. So when you had a steel blade, it was imperative that you were able to adjust the angles because you were constantly, with the sharpening, you were constantly changing the bevel angle. In today's market with the low and the high profile blades, a different type of blades, if you were to ask, which I have done, engineers of vendors who build microtomes, they would tell you that there's really no need for the clearance angle setting on a microtome anymore. But I'm going to have to kind of disagree with that. If everybody used the same disposable blade, that statement might be true. But since there are many types of disposable blades on the market, one clearance angle may not work for all brands, so you really do still need to have that. But that's what the clearance angle setting is all about. You look here, we have a low profile. Why is that called a low profile? Because it's about 1/4 of an inch high. Why is this called a high profile? Because it's about 1/2 an inch high. Now, people use based on their preference. Typically speaking, the higher profile is considered to be a little more stable for perhaps harder material, or even perhaps there is an argument out there that says the thin low profile blades are just too weak to do frozen sectioning, even though people do that. But there's an argument that says the higher profile might give you more stability when dealing with frozen material. You notice there's a third container back here. This is our super duper high profile thick blade that you might use for some hard material, slightly undecalcified bone, that sort of thing. Nothing like the strength of the tungsten carbide D profile blade though. So suggestions for some disposable blade use. That clearance angle, when you buy blades from a vendor, they should supply you with a recommended starting point. Like the blades that I use and love, I recommended 2 degrees starting point for a low profile and 5 degrees starting point for a high profile, and you would adjust it very slightly. A little bit further we'll look at some problems and we'll see which way we might adjust the clearance angle. Front and back surfaces of clamping devices must be clean and defect free. So just keep a clean surface on your knife holder. Here's one that we abuse a lot. Some of us do anyway. You need to have enough pressure on your blade holder, that little piece of metal that goes across your blade, to stabilize and support it. On some of the older blade holders, there's a right screw and a left screw, so it's very easy to over-tighten one and under-tighten the other. And on the new ones that are only one place where you make the adjustments, you can still place that down so tight that you actually bend and bow the blade, especially low profile, and you can get cutting artifacts such as thick and thin sections. The fine advanced hand wheel should be turned at a slow to moderate pace. And here we go again. Disposable blades cannot always handle extremely hard specimens. Super thick, high-profile blades will do a better job with bone or a reusable blade, especially for undecalcified bone. Microtomy, important FYIs. So we all use these plastic disposable cassettes, and they provide us with support for our blocks in the microtome. They provide us with a way to embed our tissue, and when we put them in the microtome, we have two parallel sides that provide stability for the block when it's mounted. Now the cutting force comes from the bottom of the block. Remember that X that I put in that specimen? Well, when we place the block vertically, what's happening is that we are using the angled writing area as one of our clamp surfaces. And this can be dangerous for us because we're not getting 100% of stability there. And you know, coupled with any other wrong thing going on, we could get some serious chatter and some holes, that sort of thing in our tissue. When these things were invented by the vendors, they were meant to go in with the written side, either right or left, and two equal clamping surfaces. I have done this a million times. You will continue to do it a million times, but fact says that this is the way you should present the cassette to your block holder. Now you would say, instead of turning it this way, if we go back to our suggested way of embedding this, we can still use it this way, still get the plane of least resistance as we think we're getting right here. So as far as micrometer settings go, what you said is not always what you get. The micrometer setting, it does not agree exact thickness. Thickness depends on many outside influences: temperature, knife angle, cutting speed, trimming thickness. If you trim too aggressively, you're going to get that moth hole effect. Trimming should be at a thickness of no more than 30 microns to 50 microns. Trim sections that appear as tight rolls, they're a little bit too thick, and who knows how much tissue is in there, right? Harder tissue requires even thinner trimming sections. The rate at which sections are cut will directly affect their thickness and quality. Okay, now get ready for this statement. Cutting fast will invariably compromise the quality of the section. Okay, so if you're in a spot right now where you're not embarrassed, if you can take your right hand that you would turn the thin adjust or the thin advance wheel and cut real fast. If you think about it, you will actually feel that you are adding more pressure as your hand goes down. And I'm doing it now, and I'm feeling it. If we could measure that, we could show you that you are interjecting pressure as you go down and then lessening it as you come up. This act can actually cause your micrometer to jump a half a micron, a full micron, you know, who knows how much, depending on just how much pressure you're putting on it. So you are very apt to get thick and thin sections. According to the experts and things that I have read, the optimum cutting speed, even though it depends, or it's regulated a little bit by specimen type, should be rotated 1 revolution per second. So if you're still in that spot where you can use your hand, and if you look at a clock and you see the second tick off, just move your hand. You will feel that the pressure is even. You are not exerting pressure on the downstroke nor lessening on the upstroke. It's just even. So that's an experiment that you can do for yourself. But that's what the experts say. Room and block temperature, of course, are important. We want our room to be cool. Sometimes we can't get that, but it's nice when it is. The optimum block temperature depends on embedding media and tissue type. So if we chill our hard tissue blocks, it makes tissue and wax homogeneous. Warm water exposure will soften the consistency. Aerosol coolants, they really should be discouraged. They can cause buildup of ice on the block and or cracking of the block and tissue, and you can actually lose tissue. So you might want to use that sparingly, only if you have to. Soaking the block. How many people out there, raise your hand if you soak the block? Well, soaking a block simply means that you have over-dehydrated. You've taken out too much moisture. And if I might just plug in a little side note here, during processing, diffusion allows alcohol to pass in and water to pass out. And a perfectly dehydrated specimen that is held up by this beautiful matrix will have about 3 to 4% of free water standing in it, and it will have the bound water still bound. So when you remove this, the matrix collapses, and you have over-dehydrated tissue, and you're delivering that to the microtome to be cut. It might look something like this. Typically, unfortunately, it happens more in tiny little biopsies than it does in anything else, because a lot of the times we process our biopsies with breast, with colon, and I think we're getting away from that a lot more. And if you happen to be one that's having this issue, that's one of the things you want to look at, is separating your processing, even if you have to process your small biopsies alone during the day. They need a much, much gentler processing schedule. But you can get these little cracks in the tissue. And we all know that when you soak tissue, you sit there and you try to sneak up on the tissue block so that you can actually get a ribbon on the first couple of 3 pieces, and you're going to grab one of those. And I can assure you that normally they're not 5 microns or 4 microns. One of them might be, but the next one is about 7 or 8 microns. It's just the way that soaking works. It also produces a basophilic look to the H&E. So only the first few sections, just like we said, will rehydrate when briefly exposed to water or ice. Extended soaking can cause expansion of the cut surface, and you might lose more of the tissue than you want. Proper processing is the key. Get your stuff properly processed, your microtomy is going to be so much better. Static electricity, I'll just barely mention, common in the winter. Get a humidifier. I wouldn't bother boiling water. This is an old slide. We did used to rub the work area with a dryer sheet, and it really did help. And of course, you can always blow on the section if you want to do that. So the importance of cleanliness with our knives and our microtomes cannot be overemphasized. We want to get all the debris off of it, the acids. If you decalcify at your microtome, or you use ammonia water to soak, say, really dry bone marrow clots or something, blood, something like that, then you want to clean all of that off of your knife holder, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a very rusted knife holder. And if you leave solvent on it, that's going to be even worse, because you may actually find that it eats into your blocks. So you want to get rid of all that. Let's look at a few problems, causes, and maybe some suggested fixes. We got knife mark splits. Could be calcium in there. We get that in breast biopsies and other things. Surface decalcification might work, or send it back through. Change blades, obviously, after you ruin the one that you're using. Buffer salts. This is a very interesting one. I experienced this once. There was a lot of grit in my tissue, and what we learned was that we were putting our 10% formalin straight into a high concentration. When we were on the processor, we were washing it in a high concentration of alcohol. Precipitate was forming right in the cassettes, right in the tissue where the formaldehyde was. Simple fix: go to a lower graded alcohol, 70 to 80%, you'll be fine. Knife edge dirty, but it will cause that to split like that. Knife edge damage, basically change. Scraping block, like we looked at the clearance angle, you just want to adjust your angle. All right, so everybody can see what this is. It's a beautiful example of compression. See what happens when you get too close, when you get compressed, all the cells bundle up on top of each other. You can't see through them anymore. Compressed sections can be caused by dull knife, change your blade, block too warm, chill it. Incorrect blade angle, you would want to increase the angle gradually if you're getting compression normally. Under dehydrated, well, you got to do a little reprocessing, but don't take it all the way back to formalin because all that's doing is putting a bunch of water in it. So just melt the paraffin, get the wax out, take it back to a clean 100 and move it forward through a couple more, re-clear, re-embed, and cut. It'll cut out your time, and it's much easier, and it's easier on the tissue. This looks like something like a thick and thin section like you might get after you've soaked your gastric biopsy and taken a few sections. So the blade angle could be off. Increase the blade angle. Specimen too large, that should have been done a while back. Specimen too hard, that is a definite fact with something like a cervix. So you could soak it, use a sturdier knife, or adjust the processing. But if it is a piece of tissue that is intrinsically hard, then the most you can do is try to put it in the block so you're presenting the least resistance to the blade. Get a sturdier blade, maybe soak it a little bit. Incorrect tension on the blade is the #1 cause of thick and thin sections because your blade is bending. So you need to go back to your labs and check your blades. If you've had trouble with this, check that out first because that more often than not is the cause. Sectioning too fast. Remember the pressure that we're adding when we go down? So if we're taking a section when we're going up, it would be thinner. If we take a section when we're going down, it could be thicker. So slow down, try that 1 stroke per section, and you'll get some beautiful sections. If in fact it is a microtome malfunction, then call service. With this piece of tissue, we've got chatter marks. It pretty much obviously has all the markings of an overprocessed piece of tissue, because not only do we have all these marks in there, but the tissue is overwhelmingly basophilic, and that's another mark of processed tissue. So we might soak, we might, rub the surface with some warm water, correct the angle, but honestly, correct processing is what's going to actually fix this problem. Dull knife edge, I mean, we can put all of these on here, but over-dehydration is a processing problem, not a microtomy problem. For instance, if we have a failure to ribbon here, now this is supposed to be a good specimen, but if you look closely here, it's not really ribboning. I'm actually going to have to pull that off like one piece at a time to get a sample off of it. This is a picture of ribboning. This isn't actually perfect, but it's pretty close to it. So failure to ribbon could be a dull blade, incorrect angle. You want to lower the angle there. Here's an interesting thing. How many of you know that some blades are coated? As a matter of fact, a lot of blades are coated, and I think it's fairly common knowledge out there. You can go into a lab where they actually have their blades sitting in alcohol where they will take one out at a time and kind of dry it and then put it on their microtome. We used to do this thing, we take a clean paraffin block, run it over the knife blade, put it in our microtome, run it over the knife blade, and we used to call that dulling the blade, when in fact we were removing the coating. But by dulling the blade, we were actually able to get beautiful ribbons. And before we did this, it was just like a nightmare. It was like the blade was too sharp. But excellent blades. Block too warm or too cold, adjust the temperature, static electricity. No and yes. Okay, so we got crooked ribbons. Top and bottom edge is a block not even, so you have to adjust the XY orientation if you ever get little triangles out like that. Your blade could be bowed, causing that. Holes in tissue, trimming too thick, improperly processed. Sections disintegrating on the water bath, improper processing. You need to go back and do some reprocessing. Water bath too hot, adjust temperature. Reasons to automate, real quick. You've got manual, semi, and fully automated. NIEHS, National Institute of Environmental Health Studies, and NIH say that a histotechnologist turns a microtome hand wheel as many as 500,000 times a year, and probably some of you out there turn it a lot more. Automation decreases the risk of repetitive motion disorders caused by this uninterrupted use of small muscles. I can think of 10 of my closest histotech friends right now, And every single one of us has some sort of skeletal muscular disorder that we're dealing with. And it's probably not caused from gaming, but probably caused from being in a histology lab. So automation solves the problem also of turning the hand wheel too fast. Here's where you guys ladies who want to turn that wheel fast, go get an automated microtome. It's on a motor, so it's going to be a smooth turn all the way around. You can rev that thing up as fast as it'll go without jumping off the bench, and you can get your sections done that way, and they'll be good because it's going to have equal pressure at every point on the wheel. Automation has really proven to be more productive, mostly because you don't have to take time off to take care of your carpal tunnel or something else. Mini lesson in ergonomics, and we're going to have to wrap up because our time's just about out. First of all, use your whole arm to make the revolution. If you're going to use a manual fine feed, don't rock the hand wheel. How many of you put your elbows out when you cut? I do. So keep your arms close to your body. Keep your arms off the edges of the countertops. Don't rest them there. Get some counter soft rest to put your arms on if you need to. But holding your arms against that hard countertop is going to cut your nerves off. Relax the muscles in your neck. Evaluate your reach envelope and keep all sides to a minimum of 15 to 18 inches. Try to position the water bath on an L-shaped extension, something like this. I've been into some of the newer labs, and they're all converting to this. Imagine how wonderful it would be to get your section, turn your chair, and go to your water bath. I always was reaching over one way or the other and hurting my back. Buy an ergonomic chair. Adjust the chair so the hand wheels are comfortable with a comfortable reach without compromising leg room. Use a footrest if your feet don't reach the floor. Now, take mini breaks. Even if you have to get someone to blow a whistle at 5 minutes to every hour, you should do that. Stand up, shake your arms, move your neck, massage your neck, whatever. But the big deal is, if you can, automate. So most important things today for me was process your tissue well, then you can cut it good. Use your knife holder properly and your block holder, and automate if you can. How to know if your section is good. Here's your block. That's what your well-processed tissue looks like. If I produce a slide that looks like this, I'm asking you a question, is that a good slide? I'm going to say no, but I'm going to say that this is a good slide. Here we have compression, possibly thick and thin, but here we have two samples off of this block that look identical to it in size and shape and everything. That is what you should produce from your microtome on every single block. If it's not the same size, you need to work it out and get it to that. Now I'm going to say thank you for your time.